Hello!
We're back again. Welcome to Crypt Chat UK.
He's Shabazz.
He's Pete Marshall. And like I've said, this is Crypt Chat UK. And yet again, we have another guest. And we'll let that guest introduce themselves now.
I'm Ann Borden-King, and I'm the host of the Noncompliant podcast. And this is going to be on both of our podcasts. I'm Canadian, and I'm an autistic activist, advocate person doing work in Canada. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
So, how did you get involved in activism, Anna?
Well, I've been involved in activism since I was pretty wee, because I grew up in an activist community. And then just about 4 years ago was when I started getting involved in autistic activism. And we have a lot of issues to deal with here in Ontario. So we had been in sort of a group chat, me and some other people, and we decided to launch an organization called Autistics for Autistics, which is one of Canada's first and Ontario's very first autistic-led advocacy organization. About 3 years ago, we started that up. And ever since then, we've been doing like a lot of work in the community in terms of community education, political advocacy, social activism, and a year ago, I decided to do a podcast as well called Noncompliant, where I interview people about various things affecting our communities. And then the third project that I'm involved with is the campaign against phony autism cures, which is an advocacy and activist campaign for better regulation, kind of like a lot like what Emma Dalmain and AIM are doing over in the UK to try to stop and make it illegal to do these phony treatments. So those are kind of my three projects.
Could you tell me a bit more about that third element, please? Because it's interesting to me, at least, the phony kind of treatments.
Yeah, so there are a lot of phony treatments that exist for autism. This is the whole history of autism is kind of steeped in phony treatments, even ones that were approved, obviously, by residential institutions and things like that, that amount to abuse of autistic and intellectually disabled people. There's a long, long history of it, even institutionally. There are also fringe elements of phony cures, which are more prevalent in popular culture, such as parents feeding their children bleach to try to cure their autism, believing that autism is caused by parasites, people giving people these heavy medications to try to remove metal from the child's body because they think vaccines cause the autism, and they think there was metal in the vaccines. People put their children on highly restrictive diets and give them very high levels of nutritional supplements to the point where they become physically ill, or other kind of food-based or eating disorder-based treatments. There just are so many sort of out there phony treatments that are not regulated. That's the first part of the puzzle, right? That they're allowed to do these things to their children without really anyone taking action to stop them, any kind of our justice system. They're often these treatments are not illegal, although in the UK, chelation, that metal treatment, that is illegal now. But many times people, even when you try to report that this is being done to a child, authorities don't do anything to stop it.
I mean,
ableism, because they think that it's okay to do this to an autistic child, or they don't understand. And then, of course, there are also institutional phony treatments, such as ABA, which is completely fake, but it's institutionally recognized as somehow an evidence-based autism therapy. All of these kind of therapies and treatments are really harmful to children, and nothing is really being done, which is why there's this activist movement around it now.
I mean, I would say in many ways, when we talk about phony cures, in many ways, phony cures kind of were around before there was a definition of autism.
Mm-hmm.
because I would say that a phony cure is just any cure that does not actually have a good basis of evidence and ideas around it.
Exactly.
And so, you know, you can go back to the medieval period and they talked about kind of, and you can talk about that kind of period, and they had various ideas around autistic people being possessed by the fae. And there was a whole bunch of spiritual cures around that. You can talk about things around exorcisms and stuff like that. So in that sense, I would say I think for me, wherever there has been a parent who wanted their child to act differently, you will find people who could convince them, desperate people. And I would also say that there's that in terms of saying whether something's legal or not, especially when you're talking about a nationalized healthcare system, which I think both Britain and Canada has, to a significant extent, there's kind of two definitions. The first one is whether doctors will diagnose it or whether the state will pay for it. Mm-hmm. And the second one is whether it's literally technically child abuse. And I suppose you could say there's a third, which is how much that's actually policed. Because one of the big problems is that generally phony autism cures are given predominantly by parents or by people or in kind of what would normally be regarded as home settings. So schools occasionally, care homes sometimes. So where you're talking about that, something may not be paid for by the state. I mean, for example, some may not be paid for by the state, but also may not be child abuse to give it to your child because it's regarded as a herbal remedy, for example. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I think that I'm glad you brought up the exorcism thing, because every one of these treatments, if you really look at them from a sociological perspective, it goes back to the idea of exorcising the autism out of the child. Yeah. Whether they think they're removing heavy metals or they think they're removing parasites, or they're taking stem cells and putting stem cells from, quote, healthy people into autistic children to try to literally to change the child, to change the self, which is on the face of it a complete violation of their human rights, because it's just so abusive, because it's saying, you need to be replaced by someone else. The autistic parts of you are the devil that needs to be exorcised out of you. Or now, instead of the devil, we call it the toxins. They call it the toxins that need to be taken out of you. So it does go way back to this idea of exorcising, having to fix someone, that if someone is disabled, it's not a good enough version of themselves. It has to be replaced by a better self. So the physical impact of the abuse, which is extreme, is also connected to psychological impact of always being told that they're not good enough and that they need to be replaced by a better child, and that these parts of themselves, which are so important to them, like stimming or other types of identity, are supposed to be purged. This idea of a purge. Why it's so hard to fight it legally is because much of society, still believes that autism should be purged. So it's very, very difficult to explain to people why this is wrong.
Yeah, but it's creating a future problem of psychological damage, and in future a lot of these people will need other forms of therapy, because they've always been told right from a young age that they're broken, psychologically or physically,
I would also take that from the perspective of the entire thing is, in a sense, corruption. I mean, basically, you're wasting the taxpayers' money. You're not. You're wasting kind of the potential of those individuals, obviously. And honestly, kind of there are various systems that are having to be subverted to go with kind of lower bars of evidence than they should really be accepting. In the end, if taxpayers' money is going to pay for X, Y, and pay for medication, and you are paying for, chelation to happen to an autistic child, for example, then basically, A, all that money is being wasted, and B, what's that? What is the kind of the medical regulatory body doing? Like, why does it regard these two forms of medication as something as equally as, for example, aspirin and chelation, as equally good when one is actually way better? You know, aspirin we know works, chelation we know doesn't work. So there's, I would put that into the conversation around corruption, honestly.
Yeah, it's very important. That's such an important point. I know a therapist who had a client, and it was like psychotherapy, talk therapy, and she's a decent therapist, and she does good work with clients, including autistic clients. And she had a client who was coming in, a 20-year-old guy, or I don't know how exactly old he was, a young man, and his parents suddenly decided he needed to be chelated. He needed that. The reason he was having his meltdowns, they thought, was because some scammer had told them it's because he had metals in his body. And so whenever he would start to have these a bad period, like a meltdown or a shutdown, which can happen to everyone, especially if you're stressed out because your parents are acting like freaks and giving you chelation. So he would start like going for these chelations, and eventually the psychotherapist had to stop seeing him because he had internalized this idea that the only reason he was having meltdowns and shutdowns was because of he needed to be chelated. So then the psychotherapy didn't work anymore because the family had bought into this belief system. So it's actually replacing useful therapies with these other therapies, which is also a problem. And at the heart of it, it's just a scam. It's just a scam to make money, like you said, off of people who are desperate. And we shouldn't tolerate scams in our society. So the big question is, why are these scams being tolerated? And I think the answer we're all coming to is because of ableism, because to some extent in the broader culture, people still believe it's okay to do these things.
Yeah. Do you think they're making a lot of money from these things?
Yeah. Some people are making enormous amounts of money. Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, chelation is $700 to $900 per session. And it's never just one session. They tell the families they have to keep coming back. So people will come back for 6 or 8 or 10 sessions. They make that amount of money from each of their patients. So it's a chronic thing. And actually we have an MD doing it in my province and I don't know how much he charges for it, but it's a revenue stream for these people.
So it's basically worse than going to the dentist.
Yeah.
And just for the record, it's worth pointing out that chelation, yes, it's actually a real medical thing you can get done, but normally, like, it was invented in the First World War for people who got poisoned with mustard gas. Mm-hmm. So yes, indeed, there is you are taught about it in medical school, and yes, indeed, doctors should be doing it. But unless you've got poisoned by mustard gas or like something like that, then honestly, there's no evidence that it A, works, or B, autistic people have some sort of the prerequisites to require it anyway.
And it's a trauma, exactly. And then in addition to being useless, it creates an incredible amount of trauma when you bring kids into a lab for chelation or for stem cell quote unquote treatment, or now they're doing fecal transplants where the kid has to they starve for a day or whatever. Then they have to get a bowel cleanse and they have to take antibiotics. They have to take all these medicines. Then they bring them into a lab and they inject them with fecal matter because they are under this idea that somehow if they change the microbiota in their large intestine, they'll stop being, or in their small intestine or wherever it is, they'll stop being autistic. I mean, these are like such experiments that they're doing on these kids that cause such trauma, and it's all for nothing except the profit, which is just enrages me.
And I think one of the interesting points about many of these things, and this is especially with chelation, with fecal transplants, with ABA, is honestly, like, they've worked out that if they use big scientific words, like, and you know, I would say there's biomedical versions which chelation, fecal transplants, things like that effortlessly fit into. And if you're talking ABA, that's more of a behavioral thing. So they try and like go, we're not making this person not autistic, we're making them like more. And again, this is kind of the the British variant, which it tends to be much more lovey-dovey than American variants. They're basically they're better at PR. But basically, they kind of say, yeah, we're trying to make this person not act autistic. We're trying to like make their behavior more functional, more like adaptive and things like that. And honestly, I would argue if that's their goal, then they're going about it in the wrong way.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like
they're not focused on quality of life. Yeah.
Whether you're, but I think there's an important. I mean, I would just say, like with fecal transplants, one of the things around this is actually in Manchester we have kind of one of the leading experts in kind of the brain gut nervous system, neurons. Anyway, basically there is actual respectable scientists doing actual work on kind of brain gut connections, and there's arguments around whether like gut connections can change behavior and things like that. So, and I think the least that can be said is the jury is out. I think you could effortlessly go further than that and say that some autistic people will definitely not be affected by this. If you have a problem with your kind of gut flora and fauna, basically the bacteria in your gut, it may help. I mean, I've yet to see any like cast iron and generalized evidence that it helps even most or all of any symptomatic group. So, and this is kind of
Crohn's. Yeah. Crohn's, there is some use for Crohn's, right? And so they're testing it on people with Crohn's, possibly, but there's also risk, so even a person with Crohn's who's really suffering would have to weigh the physical risk of doing it against that. But what we have with the experiments is we have it being done on children for a condition it's not indicated for, where there is risk. And then that's where it's really problematic. There's a kind of a schism, I think, between people who want to cure, or in the way they couch it as treat the core symptoms of autism, right? They give it those fake words like you're talking about. So people who want to cure autism and people who want autistic people to have a better quality of life.
Yeah.
And having a better quality of life doesn't mean curing. They're two completely different concepts, because when people try to cure, they create trauma and cause problems in lifelong problems for autistic people when their parents try to cure them. That's not a quality of life decision to try to cure. The quality of life decisions are about making the world a more accepting and welcoming place for autistic people. That those are the two, that's the binary, I think. I mean,
yeah, it sounds to me like this treatments sound to me like old-fashioned like shock therapy kind of thing, and it shock therapy was outlawed years ago. And
it's still used on some people for specific circumstances, but the way it was used, yes, it's.
And I can't believe that people still allow this kind of things to go on, in developed countries as well. From me speaking largely from the outside, it just seems like utterly ridiculous. And that said, when you talk about you doing activism and setting up all these different groups, is this a daily struggle that you're fighting through your activism then?
Yeah, it is for so many people, and it crosses into a whole broader ideas about disability in general. When you look at the idea, and this is true of many, many disabilities, that there's somehow still this idea that the child has to suffer to be rehabilitated, and that suffering is a part of rehabilitation. And there's that moment of relief that people feel sometimes in lucky circumstances when they become an adult, of, hey, you know what, I can actually take care of myself and do rehab and get therapy, and it doesn't have to be painful, and I don't have to suffer, but this is something that children grow up with believing about not just autism, but about a whole host of disabilities. And our society shouldn't be buying into that. Quality of life begins now. It begins the minute someone is a child, that focus on quality of life. And I don't think we have that very broadly.
I mean, one of the more fascinating things for me about these cures is, and again, this is a very dark conversation, but I think if you look at a lot of, like, again, I'm trying to come up with the least, like, nasty way of saying this, but you would have thought that there, in many of these things, they are painful, physically painful. Children end up screaming and crying, and you know, it is completely obvious that the child in many of these situations, this is not fun for anybody. And you would have thought that at some point you would just go, why am I still doing this?
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of one of those fascinating things that especially if you look at kind of MME, then, which is the bleach you were mentioning earlier, then there seems to be this feeling of, it's not that, like, people try it for like 2 weeks and then go, oh well, this hasn't helped my child, so I'll just not do it. Mm-hmm. They seem to be, like, talked by the experts into, like, going, well, this didn't work for 2 weeks, but that just means that your child's autism needs to, we need to go at this even harder.
Yeah.
And I think, honestly, like, that's one of those, like, strange psychological elements of this. And this is kind of really where the con comes in, as far as I'm concerned, because you're like, well, it would be one thing if this is just like, if you bought, many of these chemicals probably would be horrendous if you took them once. But honestly, the fact that they're taking them for years and years and years can have massive impacts. And I think, and so that's kind of an element of this which I don't think gets discussed enough. It's just, it becomes like yeah. There's a deeper argument here, but I don't want to say like a tremendous amount of gory stuff.
Well, the image in media, when you see this topic covered, people tend to think that parents are just so desperate that they try this one thing one time. And that's the profile of the parent. The desperate parent, we never hear about the desperate children, they're invisible. The desperate parent is trying this one thing because they got so desperate. But I've been in really infiltrating social media with Melissa Eaton and Amanda Siegler and Emma Dalmain. We go into the groups, the social media groups that are run by these scammers, especially the MS groups and other groups selling these scam products. They're all on social media. They have groups on Facebook, and they create an echo chamber on Facebook for parents, where the parents go and they say, oh, my child is like, vomiting blood after this treatment or whatever, some terrible thing is happening. And then the provider gets on and they say, oh, well, that's herxing. That's a natural reaction. That means it's working. And they convince the parents into this whole mindset that somehow suffering and pain are part of the process. And then they can sell more product. I mean, there's a very, especially with MMS, very evil, sadistic people at work with that particular treatment. And on a smaller level with some other treatments that somehow, that it's all justified. They always find a justification for it. And what you see in these groups is parents are not just desperately trying one thing. You see the same parents in 5 different groups for 5 different kinds of treatments. They're doing 4 or 5 different things to their kids at once. B vitamin injections, chelation, stem cells. They've tried MMS. So that those parents that are multiply going in and trying multiple things of these quack cures, they have a disorder. They need to be treated. They're child abusers. They need help. So, and that is never talked about, because you're never supposed to say anything quote unquote bad about parents. But I interviewed a guy on my show a couple of weeks ago who specializes in Munchausen by proxy, and how people pretend their children are ill and subject them to painful treatments to get attention for themselves. And we talked about how parents who do these multiple treatments and these multiple very abusive things to their children to cure their autism, at some point, that's a disorder. The parent has a disorder and the parent needs help. But we never talk about that.
So is that one of the reasons you started your podcast, was to do activism?
Yeah, I started Noncompliant to kind of raise awareness and get people to talk about things that they don't normally talk about, right? Such as these topics and compliance. I called it non-compliant because I think we have to be non-compliant, you know, and most of us have been non-compliant because compliance is always the ultimate end for all of these treatments, including ABA. The goal isn't quality of life and happiness and joy for the person. The goal is that they're compliant and quiet and at school and with their parents, and that they please the authority figures in their life. And that the whole autism thing has been focused around that until just a few years ago, when autistic researchers finally started taking the scene and the neurodiversity movement started up. We're at a very early stage in terms of even being able to argue that we shouldn't have to be constantly compliant in childhood or adulthood. That's really the sticking point. That's the goal for most of these treatments.
What about local lawmakers? Are they receptive to your arguments? And, is anybody trying to outlaw any of this or put forward any legislation to stop any of this kind of thing?
There are some. I mean, you could talk maybe in the UK. There's been more in the UK. They had actually a parliamentary committee had a meeting about phony autism cures. I think this was brought about by autistic advocates and activists approached Barry Sheeran, who's an MP there, and they had a hearing about it. And they talked about all of the problematic cures. And coming out of that, or contingent with that, the NICE guidelines of the British health system came out with guidelines, and they said do not use XYZ treatment. So for example, chelation now is on the do not use chelation for autism officially under the mandate, isn't funded, isn't endorsed by the health system. So there's been some progress in the UK on that. And you know, less so in the US. Sometimes, I mean, there was the MMS people who obviously are the biggest target because what they're doing is so horrific. They actually were arrested by federal marshals in the United States. They were in hiding. It was the Grenon brothers who run this sort of church, this sort of cult around bleached cures. They were arrested and they're facing charges from the US federal government. So on some of the more egregious ones, there's definitely, the ball is starting to roll, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I would just, I mean, first point, I think that there's a conversation which is barely being had. And it's like, I think that when it comes to white Protestant cures, especially in the UK, like MMS is, I think, a very white Protestant thing. That they are starting to be discussed more. I think it's like there's entire interesting discussions that are barely being had. That, for example, there was a report out from the National Autistic Society on BAME issues, and one of the instances they highlighted, they got a BAME researcher to do this thing, and one of the instances he highlighted was that one family sent their child back to Africa to have this horrendous exorcism done, and you know, this involved him being staked outside, like in the burning sun for days on end with barely any food and water, and getting, you know, and that was seen as, and that was like a form of exorcism. There is, you know, there's been a couple of things this year, where they were talking pre-COVID about Eastern Europeans who were offering these like weird behavioral cures that cures obviously, that ended up in like, and I think Emma Delmain had something to do with that anyway, but this ended up in like people being shouted at, and it was like and they were supposed to be like more behavioral. So I think there is an element in this where what gets noticed and picked up first ends up being very white Protestant, and so I think that's kind of worth pointing out. Onto like, I think this is part of what I meant by the kind of, I think laws in some ways are overrated in this, because I think that it's like the people who know about this kind of thing. There's two groups really. There is medical professionals and there is the police.
Mhm.
And functionally speaking, those are the two that it's things that they respond to. So NICE is just the most important group around this. And I don't know what the Canadian equivalent is,
Health
but in
Canada.
the end, excuse me?
Health Canada, yeah.
I would advise, getting them moving on this is the most important thing. And like in terms of talking, and I think one area that honestly the British community has barely even started, like it's a really complicated one, is how do you talk to the police about this? Because technically speaking, doing some of these is child abuse. Many of these honestly is child abuse. But in terms of getting it through court, making sure that when it happens, it actually gets directed towards the police, and then blah 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 blah.
Mhm.
So I think actually no, I'll add a group to that: social workers. So
And
yeah.
I just wanted to say to you before we move on to our next topic, is there any message you'd like to give to Health Canada, for example, something they should be doing, like in order to make things a lot better? I would like you to give some sort of lawmakers a message so that if they do hear this, they can take note.
Yeah, I think that's right, that there does need to be a message out to, well, for Health Canada. So in Canada, Health Canada regulates what people can say about a product and what products people can sell, right? So that's what Health Canada does. So Health Canada needs to be more aggressive going after the sellers for their claims and for their sales. Provincially, if a doctor is doing something, for example, like chelation you mentioned, that's off label. So that's a product that they'll always be able to sell. And the company isn't marketing it as an autism treatment. So Health Canada can't go after them because it's the seller, it's not the seller, right? It's the provider, it's the health provider. That is on the province, that's on the provincial regulatory colleges. And so to the provincial regulatory colleges, they've been largely like very remiss and really, really haven't done their job in terms of stopping people from doing the provision. And then the third piece of the puzzle, like we just talked about, is okay, we get the regulators, we get the enforcement. This is all very, very crucial. The other part of it is changing people's attitudes about autism to begin with, so that people aren't even seeking this out to begin with. And we can starve out that market to keep the market from, if nobody was buying it, they could try to sell it all they wanted, right? And so that's a big problem. And that's a problem that people don't like to talk about, that sometimes, we got to get to work with parents and educate them and deal with them as well as part of how this happens. They're not just, they have agency. They can say no too, right?
To be slightly nicer to parents,
Mm-hmm.
I think there is a discussion about what do they want? Like, what would their ideal life with their child be? Because I think that, like, there's an element of, because I think, honestly, in terms of can we set up better services for around schools and around social care and around social workers and make their lives easier, I think if we could do that, if that would help, I would be perfectly happy to support that. I think I have to say there is I would be more convinced by their attitudes, honestly, if they were going first to lawmakers and were like working through groups to improve the services, as apart from going like, what do I want to do to make my life better? I know, I'll put my child through expensive and painful medical treatments, So yeah.
But beyond that,
sorry, go on.
Sure. Yeah. I was just going to say one last point. We need buy-in as well. We don't need it, but it would be nice to have buy-in from the autism organizations themselves. And these are the groups, the carer-based groups, such as charities and other service providers, to be really proactive in stopping it. rather than taking the approach of just turning the other way and not really doing it. So one thing my organization has done is we put a guide. We only did it for physicians. We should try to have some confidence in autism service providers and do one for them too. But we did it at first for physicians and said, here's what you can do if your patient comes in and their parents are talking about doing these things to them, here's how you can intervene. Kind of looking at the people on the outside who could be who could intervene when they hear about these things happening as well, and educate families and parents. Because when parents get an autism diagnosis for their child, they get told a lot of things that are very wrong, and it gets treated like the most horrific tragedy that could ever happen to them. And they get told that they have to take action right away, early intervention, or nothing will happen. And that's what causes them to panic and start throwing all these cures at their kids. So from the moment the child is diagnosed, we need medical professionals, we need social workers, like you were saying, schools, and autism organizations, service organizations, to counter that message, counter that negative message about autism. So really, really, really key.
And now, should we move on to our next topic, even though we haven't got a lot of time?
Yes.
So we can touch on it, and maybe you can come back in the future if you want to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, Sia and her film. Do you want to talk about it?
Me?
Oh,
Yeah.
I mean, I could start, but yeah.
I never heard of her before, so it came out of the blue for me. I guess she's very popular. I mean, would you describe kind of maybe what's happening and then?
Okay, I don't mind. Actually, I'm working an article right now. Anyway,
Oh, great.
Sia is basically, she's a Australian pop singer. She's always been fairly indie, but one of the most popular of the indie kind of pop singers. I've never been a terrific fan of her work, but okay.
Mm-hmm.
She's popular. And basically, I think it's a music video. And
no, it's a film.
Yeah, it's a feature film.
It's a directorial debut feature film.
And basically, it's called Music. And essentially, it has an essentially she's using, there is kind of two-ish main characters, one of whom is a recovering drug addict, the other one is kind of her kind of severely, again, basically her sister who's autistic and requires care and has had and yada 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 yada. And I think essentially from what I can see, she decided, one of her favorite like backup dancers, I think, has done a few acting gigs, and I think Sia wanted to give her kind of a big debut. And so basically this dancer slash actor has ended up playing the autistic character in it. And I think that's probably the shortest synopsis I can give.
And she studied for the role. The actress studied for the role not by talking to non-speaking autistic people, because this character is non-speaking. So normally if you were playing a non-speaking autistic person, you would go and get to know a few non-speaking autistic people to understand their reality. But she didn't do that. She never, in fact, I don't think the producers spoke to any autistic people in researching the film. They watched videos and they talked to Autism Speaks about autism.
I've heard mixed. I think that Sia, again, the problem is that most of the information Sia's given is when she was arguing with people over Twitter. So I think quite possibly, and again, she's both gone back and forward on that. She originally said she had spoken to Autism Speaks. And then when someone said they're horrible, I think she went, oh, I knew that. I didn't speak to them. And it was, so honestly, like, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if you know, but I've got a film background, so I've lived in this world, and I know how tricky it could be for casting. But in terms of research, you've got no excuse. You know, if they haven't spoken to the right kind of autistic, you know, a diverse range of autistic groups, then there's no excuse for that kind of, you know, for that kind of behavior. Because I don't, you know, you could say it's hard to find an autistic actor who can do the role, or there's not many out there, or you can make any sort of argument. But in terms of research and not doing your research, I don't think that's very forgivable.
Mhm.
That's my opinion, anyway.
I mean, I think in part, like, I think for me, my favorite takeaway from this is I'm not sure why I think honestly, the autistic community should be, and others should be helping us to create something of an indie scene. I mean, it's worth pointing out that if we want to create stories about each other for like that are actually good, and make sure that we have making sure we can and we can find actors that kind of represent us in the way we like that would be the obvious way that we would do it. So I mean, because I mean one of the things that isn't being discussed, because I mean, granted the act is kind of the major problem, is kind of two of the major themes I find fairly problematic. The first is a kind of this notion of like the autistic girl is the family, and she represents the family, and this like recovering drug addict is like her guardian and her carer and blah 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 blah. And I must admit that like I suppose it's not terrible in terms of we're actually being normalized in that sense. Although having said that, like many autistic people have lives outside of the home, and all autistic people should have lives outside of the home. And, you know, it is fairly problematic that this girl is having to rely on her sister basically getting her shit together in order to actually like run her life. And I mean, honestly,
has there been a lot of debate about? Sorry to cut you off. You want to finish? Or?
Just a quick point that I think it was always fairly problematic, because one of the kind of things that, again, I've heard it being used, depending on the source, this is a theme / isn't a thing, but the notion of like, which one's reality is better, the autistic girl or the other girl? And I think I find like one of the major issues with that is basically film heavily rewards being in control and powerful. Like that is like all film does. Just the shots, just the way people look, just blah, blah, blah. If you are in control, your viewpoint will always seem more defensible. You will seem more defendable. And in the end, that means that if you have a and that ends up meaning that actually, like, for example, my favorite film about autistic people is called Chocolate, not Chocolat, Chocolate. And it's an incredibly random title. And basically it's got a non-verbal autistic girl. It was created in Thailand. And the way that, and basically has a similar theme, but the way it gets around the notion that entire thing is her like obsession is martial arts. And so she is incredibly significant. And so her perspective is intrinsically relevant. And I think, honestly, if you don't do something fairly massive to weigh in, then just going, well, we have two different perspectives. The one in control will always be more significant in storytelling terms.
Shahbaz, I was going to ask, or were you going to say something first? I'll wait. I'll hold my question.
No, you go for it.
Yeah, I was going to ask Shahbaz, from your experience in film, is this kind of a chronic problem where people aren't doing the right kind of research, especially for underrepresented?
Yes, it is a chronic problem, I would say. And the other problem is that Hollywood actors and well-known actors always want to play disabled parts because they're more likely to get an award for it.
Yeah.
Do you get what I mean? So it's good for your career. If like Daniel Day-Lewis is still known for my left foot, you know? And that was done when I was a kid, you know? And Bryan Cranston recently played a disabled person. You know, there's always, you know, that kind of. Eddie Redmayne, for fuck's sake, won an Oscar for being, what, you know, what's he called? Stephen Hawking, for example. And that was only a few years ago.
Have there ever been an abled actor who's done a good job playing a disabled character?
I mean, just to quickly chime in, I think one of the problems here is not necessarily is the fact that range is always something that non-disabled actors have. And so if you're a disabled actor and you want to play an able-bodied role, could Shabazz hypothetically be playing like a walking role and then have CGI'd and have CGI? Yes. Is that actually going to be? Is that actually, or is that actually? Does that ever actually happen?
I'll let the world into a little secret. When I was a child, I wanted to become an actor. The only reason I didn't was because I finally realised that there would only be a very, very, very small window of characters I could play. So that's why I didn't go into it. And you know. But the other way around, able-bodied people can play disabled characters, so it even takes us out of the equation in that case as well.
Although, just to say, to be fair, I think there is a distinct thing around. Hypothetically, they can, although I'm not sure it's in. Although I think there becomes as well a discussion about what is a good disabled. What is a high quality role, or what does a actor who's playing a good disabled role look like? Because I think very often they incentivize kind of what disabled people think, or sorry, what able-bodied people think disabled people look like, as apart from what disabled people think disability looks like. And I think the same thing really probably applies here with autism. To be fair, none of us have actually watched the thing, so who knows? And in Chocolate, an able-bodied character, a non-autistic character actor does an amazing job as the autistic.
Yeah, I'd just like to say thank you, Anna, from Noncompliant podcast.
It was a really good conversation. It was really interesting.
Yeah, we hope to have you on again, and we hope to get an invite onto your podcast. And for you to interview us.
See you, and bye.
See you, bye.